So I wanted something a little more visually interesting with the basis for my Deathwatch. Something still like a desert, but with a little bit more foliage, a little more life to it, not just something flat and boring. Mainly because a lot of my friends in my hobby group give me shit for it. So one of the, I guess, challenges I had with this particular model, the Chaplain, is that his base has a bit of a scenic element. This stonework, um, I struggled a bit thinking about how to paint this. My initial thought was maybe some sort of desert stone to sort of match this, but I think in the end I decided on painting this like asphalt, like some sort of a paved road that's been worn down and broken and cracked. Um, I'll introduce some weathering, and in my highlights, I'll warm it up in a brown tone, such so it's closer in tone to this base, although of course it'll still be in the black. And by using another different black recipe, I'll be able to separate the black of the armor from the black of the wheel with a different tone of black for the pavement. Now, because this model sitting on top of it it's going to be fairly bright. I want to focus some of my more shadowed elements back here, so it'll be darker here. I'll keep the concrete or the asphalt brighter over here. And then I feel like I almost want to freehand some lane lines just to introduce a bit of color. So I think that'll be fun to work on. Because the texture paste that we're going to be using is a colored texture paste we won't be painting on top of afterwards. We want to get all the painting done on this base's scenic element first before we proceed with the texturing and the foliage. So the colors I'm going to use to paint the asphalt: black from Vallejo, which I will mix with my dark Fleshtone from Vallejo Game Air, and then highlighting by mixing in Hykey Yellow from Scale Colors Fantasy Games line. I think to paint the lane line, I'm going to go sort of like an off-white or a dirty white. So I'm probably going to be using something like an ice yellow. So I'll probably use like an ice yellow mixed in with a bit of ivory. So to start, we're going to base coat the entire thing with a 50-50 mix of dark flesh tone and black. Now I will be using a black oil wash to refine or to touch up some of these crevices and cracks. So at this point, I am not focused on maintaining or keeping those cracks defined. If I get some paint in them, that's not a big deal for me, as I will be correcting them afterwards. I want to make sure that we get the sides of this concrete or this asphalt in our 50-50 brown-black mix as well. Although once I apply the texture paste, I'm going to be building it up to cover a lot of this groundwork in here. So I don't need to paint all the way down, and I don't need the sides to be perfect either. And then to highlight the stone, we're just going to start mixing in progressive amounts of Hykey Yellow. This will brighten up the black, and the dark flesh tone will keep it in a very warm brown, or keep it with a nice warm brown tone. And I'm using an old brush for this. It no longer maintains a tip, but that's okay because the way that this paint applies, or the way that this brush applies paint, the strokes are very rough, and it has this very nice textural quality to it. Once again, I'm not going to worry about highlighting this bright central portion because that's where the bike sits, right on top right here. Um, so it's this side right here that is going to receive most of the highlights, and I'm going to apply a bit on the back surface over here as well. Now again, when you're painting in sub-assemblies, it's always useful just to do a model check periodically. Just make sure that your highlighting is consistent. You're putting it where you want it. It's nothing worse than painting all these parts individually, putting it together, and then realizing that your highlights don't make sense, or that something's just off with the placement of your lights and shadows. And I'm just going to apply a couple of bands of highlight, something very simple on the side. Most of this will be covered up with the texture paste and weathering powders, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this part right here. And using a better brush, we're just going to refine some highlights on the sharp edges and some of the cracks of the rocks. And this is just our black-brown Hykey Yellow mix. A little brighter on the Hykey Yellow. And I'm taking this opportunity as well to just add a bit more a neater surface texture to the rock. So I'm painting in some spots, some cracks, some lines. My goal is to simulate a little more visual interest and detail. And because this, the actual plastic piece of this model, the rocks is flat. It's perfectly smooth. So the more that we can do to add this texture to the surface, the more convincing we can make this thing look like actually like it's cracked concrete or asphalt. Cool. So once we're happy with the way that the concrete looks, we're going to then add our lane lines in. Now to do this, we're just going to start with a diluted ice yellow. And I'm just going to put a very simple double line, probably okay. So one of the I guess you can call it a concept in art is the idea of creating lines that direct the viewer's eye, and basically you can basically control through your perspective, through the way you um, create direction and movement in your piece to direct the viewer to where you want to look. Now, when you're looking at this model, especially from the front angle, his head is looking this way, and the bike is pointing this way with the crozius going up. One thing you also want to avoid is having too many lines heading in the same direction. So I don't want the lines for the lanes to be going in the same direction as the bike. And I think to help reinforce the direction that the chaplain is looking, because he is pointing this way, I'm going to mirror that in the lane lines on the front rock, because they are going to jut out in the front here. You will see them. It'll help to reinforce that look. An also interesting point of motion as well, the front wheel of the bike is turning. So he is moving in a curved direction towards where he's looking. So my painting the lane lines in that fashion right here will help to reinforce that motion. So that's going to be roughly here. I'm going to vary the line just a touch on these panels and then on this one to represent that it's cracking. And as the concrete shifts, so too will the lines. I'm being very quick with the lines at this stage, very rough. If I paint them in the wrong spot or if they need correcting, I can just go back in with my gray mix and just cover it up. And these splotches of color will just add a bit more texture to the road. So now that I've roughly blocked in where the lines are, I want to again do a quick visual check. And I'm pretty happy with the way that they're positioned. So now I'm going to thicken them up a bit and neaten them as well. Now, it's up to you how neat you want to be at this stage. Because I want his environment to be very, very weathered, very old and worn, I'm okay with the lane lines being a little uneven, a little patchy, to represent them being worn down by just use and time. And you can see that as I'm putting progressive base coats of color on the lines, I'm also slowly refining the edge. I'm thickening up the lines so that they're uniform across, and as I do, I'm getting neater and neater on the edges. So that by the time I'm done, I'll have nice clean edges and uniform uniform lines in terms of the width. Now you can choose to use masking tape or painter's tape to mask off these lines and airbrush them, paint them by hand using the masks as a guide. I'm choosing to forego that step because I actually think that something a little too straight, a little too perfect, feels weird to me. Um, there is a beautiful quality about hand painted lines and freehand work that just doesn't beat masking or stencils for me, particularly with this kind of work. So um, when I'm painting lines or geometric shapes like checks and chevrons and stuff, I tend to prefer to hand paint all of that instead of using masks or stencils. There's just a quality to it that just can't be beat, in my opinion, anyways. Okay, and then it's a little thick over here I'm just going to correct it with a bit of my gray. That. And then I'm going to go back in with just a little bit of ice yellow, or sorry, with a bit of ivory. And I'm just going to highlight this part right here. And then we're going to quickly hit up with an oil wash to just refine some of these cracks. And for this, I'm just using my magic wash of 50-50 black and a dark brown. And then that's 50-50 with mineral spirits. And we're just going to let capillary action do all the work. Okay. So the last thing we have to paint now is the brass shell casing on the base before we can apply our texture. So for that, we're just going to be using Viking gold and a touch of this dwarven gold from scale 75. Now most of this gets covered up with our ground texture and our weathering powders, so we're not going to be too worried about having too much light and shadow on this. We're just looking to get the base color on there and one strong highlight. And then with our dwarven gold, we're just going to paint a strong line for our highlight on top. So we use quite a few materials when we're creating these bases, and I'm going to describe the materials or relist them and then describe how I use them at every step. But I wanted to just sort of generally cover the materials that we're going to be using as a brief overview. So to create the general ground texture, we're going to be using a colored acrylic material from AK Interactives. And for this, we're going to be using Sandy Desert and Dark Earth. Now these can just be applied with a palette knife or an old brush because they're acrylic, they can be diluted and pushed around. And when they dry very solid, very durable, and they don't require any painting. Basically, these allow me to apply ground texture in fewer steps. They're more durable. They're my preferred method. We're going to be using a number of weathering powders from Vallejo. So for this, we're going to be using a dark yellow ochre, a burnt umber, and a dark red ochre. To apply that, we're going to need an old brush. and then some mineral spirits. I have them in a spritzer bottle to help fix and secure the powders. For tufts and foliage, we're going to be using a number of materials. We're using Army Painter's Swamp Tufts, and then we also have a couple of MiniNature Tufts, a goldenrod autumn sort of a weed thing, and then some foliage. It's got these nice brown, red, and orange flecks for some added color. And then we're also going to be using this tall shrubbery from Green Stuff World. It's got this nice red color, and it'll help tie in the base with a bit of red to the models, which will also feature quite a bit of red in the detailing. For the grass, we're going to use a combination of 3 materials. So the first main one is it's a mix. So I've had this for quite a number of years. It's essentially a mix of green flock, some white sand, some pebbles, and then just leaves have been crushed up and ground up in there to create a nice mix. So we apply this as our first pass. And then we follow that up with 2 passes of different colors. So we're using Army Painter's Grass Green. This green is slightly brighter than my mix, and I'm using it to just create patches of visual interest, of adding some different green elements for variety. And then I also have some playground sand. Now this is has been sifted to collect a lot of the larger rocks, but there's still a few in there that I've kept, and then a lot of the fine sand as well. And much like the grass green, it's there to create patches of visual interest. One of the neat things that railway modelers do when they're working on their terrain on other tables, they very, very rarely use just one tuft or one color. Nature is all about variety, and by creating different patches or different clusters of color, we just make our bases look that much more realistic. So the texture of our base is going to be applied with 2 products, both from AK Interactive. And you can tell that I haven't painted any of this ground texture around the concrete. And that's because we're going to be covering it all up with this stuff. So the main color is going to be the sandy desert color. And then I'm going to use a touch of the dark earth in some of the cracks and stuff around the concrete. And just to create a bit more of a darker, more soil-like color where I intend to apply my foliage. So you can see here that this base color is predominantly the sandy desert, all in this area. And then underneath where this foliage is, to simulate the wetness of the soil, I have dark earth. To apply these, I'm going to be using a palette knife, but because they are both acrylic products, you can use an old paintbrush. You can dilute them with water. Just make sure that you clean the brush thoroughly and be careful when using water to dilute them, because it will weaken the overall finish of the piece. So I'm going to start with my dark earth, and again, I'm really just focusing this color on where I expect to have the foliage. And you see where the sculpted ground texture is. I am just covering that up with this paste. Now you can really pile this material on. It doesn't really deflate when it dries. So it's really nice to help build up these volumes and create a bit of unevenness to the ground. If you end up covering any of the stones or the brass shells, that's fine. It just makes it look like it's been buried or covered there for a while. And once we have that color applied, we're then going to switch over to our sandy desert to fill in the rest of the base. So you can see I really haven't done a whole lot of effort to blend the two together. Um, just because once I apply the foliage and the weathering powders, it tends to create a more smoother, more seamless transition. What I am going to do though is I'm going to take an old brush, wet it with a bit of water, and I'm just going to smooth out some of the, I guess the lines or the imprints left from the palette knife, just to help um, smooth out some of these rougher areas that have a bit too much of that sharp uh, carve to them. And that's our sand texture applied. Now, I've applied this fairly thickly, so you're going to want to give this time to fully dry, probably at least 24 hours, maybe 48 just to be safe. So we're going to let this dry, fully cure, and then we'll come back to it for our foliage and weathering powders. So once the AK ground texture is dry on our base, it's time to start adding 2 passes of weathering powder. So we start with 1 pass, we add our foliage, we let the super glue set, and then we add a second pass of weathering powder to tie it all together. So the weathering powders that we're going to use in our first pass are all from Vallejo. We're using this burnt umber, a dark yellow ochre, and then a dark red ochre. We're going to start with a 50-50 mix of the burnt umber and yellow ochre, and we're just looking to transition some of these darker spots and brighter spots. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just to add a bit of a greater softness to it. And then we're going to follow that up with some spot um, highlights, quote unquote. We're going to put some spots of dark yellow ochre to brighten up a few spots, and then we're going to add just a touch of dark red ochre for some color interest. Very, very subtle. You can see a bit of it in this corner right here. We're just going to add a few spots of it just to create a bit more visual interest. So using an old brush, we're just going to mix a 50-50 ratio of these two colors using an old pot. And we're just looking to knock back some of the harshness in the dark to light transition that we had with the weathering with the acrylic pigment. We're also going to start putting some of this weathering on the concrete as well. Not completely covering, we're just looking to add spots and patches of color. I'm really going to be just focusing this around some of the larger crack areas where the dust is going to settle and collect. Once we've applied that 50-50 mix, we're now going to go in with just pure yellow ochre and the pure dark red ochre and add some spots of color. Start with the ochre. We don't want too much on our brush, just a tiny bit, and we're going to just dry brush this this powder in some of the brighter spots. I'm going to be very sparing with this. And we'll do the same with the red. And we'll apply a little bit of these two colors to the pavement. So once we've finished with our first pass of the weathering powders, it's now time to start applying our foliage, our ground texture. So to apply all of this foliage, this ground texture, we're going to be using super glue. And then to apply this, you can use toothpicks or just any old stick. I'm just going to be using these wooden dowels because they're what I have on hand and they're never going to be used otherwise. So there's a couple of layers that we're going to be applying to this base. The first is the grass and the rocks. Now for this, we're going to be using 3 materials. So the first is a combination of sand, green flock, some rock pebbles, and then broken leaves. And this forms sort of the major bulk or the largest portion of our ground foliage or grass. I'm going to follow this up with a little bit of grass green to brighten up some spots and add a little bit more color in just select spots, not all over. See that here? The flock that's used in both aren't quite the same. This one's a little brighter, this one's a little darker, but I don't want to mix too much of this in here. That's why I'm keeping them separate. And then we'll also follow that up with some white sand. Now this has quite a few larger rock fragments and rock pieces. Again, I don't want to mix too much of this into this to affect the color, so I'm going to keep it separate. And what we'll do is we'll do one coat of super glue, and then we'll quickly sprinkle all 3, one after another, on the base. Now, on a base this size, you can probably get away with just doing one quick layer of super glue and then sprinkling it all on before it dries. This base is quite a little bit larger, and more than likely, parts will begin drying before I can spread the super glue all the way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do half of the base, flock and texture it, and then do the other half, flock and texture. So with the stick, just really make sure that you're getting the super glue spread around. Where it's going to start fading, just really gently scrape it across the surface and get that super glue to start dotting or scattering in these nice patchy splatters. So that's our first half, and we're just going to quickly okay. Now while the super glue is still wet, we go on to our next step, adding just a few spots of this extra green color. And the goal is to not apply evenly over the entire thing, but to create patches of interest. So some areas might have a few more pebbles or rocks. Some areas might have a few more or more of this green flock or green texture. And once we've done that one half, we're going to repeat the same on the other. and that's looking pretty good. So the next step is to add some plants and some tufts just to add a bit of that height, that vertical texture, and just to create that little bit of extra visual interest. So again, we're going to be applying this with super glue, and you can use your fingers to place these tufts, but we're going to use tweezers for a little more accuracy and precision, particularly with this plant right here, some of these weeds, and these red shrubs. So for the grassy tufts, I'm using Army Painter's Swamp Tufts. And then for the foliage plants, I'm using MiniNature has these autumnal tufts, essentially similar to this green, but with these orange, red, and yellow leaves and flowers on them. We're also going to be using MiniNature's Goldenrod Autumn for the weeds. And then we're using Green Stuff World's Tall Shrubbery to inject some of this red color. Now, the reason I'm using this red is because my Deathwatch army is going to have a lot of red in them. So like the red bolter casings, red purity seals, things like that. And I wanted to introduce a bit of that color into the base to help tie the two together without necessarily overpowering anything. So I feel like little sprinkles of this is a natural way to inject that color in there. It's also why I added some of that red weathering powder with the dark red ochre. It was just to add that subtle hint of red into the base to help tie everything together. So we're going to be fairly sparing with the foliage or the tufts that we're going to apply, keeping in mind, of course, that this model is fairly busy. So we're just going to quickly drop this model in, just so you can see just exactly where he sits and how you want everything to sort of frame the model. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to put a couple of these weeds right into the cracks right here where the rocks are. So in my experience, I found that the weeds particularly grow in these dark cracks and crevices in the concrete. Really annoying to pick out on things like the driveway or a walkway in the backyard, but they can look very nice and natural here on our base. I'm going to put some of these flowering tufts just on the edges back here. I'm going to put maybe one or two of these green tufts over here to fill up some of the space. Maybe some of the flower ones over here. And then depending on how that fits out, we'll drop in some smaller red shrubs just scattered throughout. So when you're using this goldenrod, it comes in a cluster like this, and what you really have to do is you have to cut or slice along this one of these axes or along the length of them, and the height that you cut determines, or the length that you cut determines the height of the plant, and you can group them, you can cluster them, and then super glue them together to create larger clusters of these weeds. So you can see here I've pulled 2 little clusters of these weeds. I'm going to trim this one just a little bit to make it shorter, and that way we have different heights in the 2 different weeds that we're going to be applying. So I think this one I'm going to be applying right here. And so we're just going to drop a bit of super glue. And I'm going to lightly place that on and let that dry. I think I want the second one. So you have to be careful with these. In my experience, I use them a lot on my old Vampire Counts army. They look amazing. They're fairly durable. However, they can be very easily broken off. The contact point of these stems to the base is fairly tiny, and you don't want to put them anywhere near the edge of a base. Um, Regular handling will break them off. If they're on the top surface of a base where you're not like smushing them or running your finger across, they're okay. But you don't want to put them right on the edge here, because if you were to pick up the model or brush up against it as you're moving across the table, it will break off. So I think I'll put the second one right there. So now we're going to add some of these green swamp tufts. Now I've already got a lot of texture and stuff on this base already between the pavement and um, the green tufts, or the green grass that we've already applied. And so we can be fairly sparing with how many of these swamp tufts that we apply. So now that we're going to be applying our grassy tufts and the tufts with the foliage, we have to remember that this base is already fairly busy. Between the model itself, the ground pavement, and then the grass that we've already applied, there's quite a bit going on. And so we don't need too many of these tufts in there. Otherwise, it can get a little overgrown and we lose that desert feel. So I'm going to pick out maybe one medium size tuft. Right there. Maybe we put a medium-sized one. In the back like that. Now at this stage, because once you glue them down, it's all final, I'm going to be test fitting or dry fitting a bunch of this foliage on there to make sure that everything looks the way I want it to before I glue it down. I'll grab a couple of these. a tiny one in the back there. Okay, so much like the goldenrod autumn tufts that we applied, that come in these clusters that we have to trim and cut. These are very much the same. So they come in these massive chunks, like so, and you have to pull them apart. You can trim them, you can stick them straight up standing like tall weeds or plants, or you can cut them down and make little clusters with them, which is my preferred method of application. The tall ones, if applying them tall, are a little too fragile for gaming pieces. Just be very careful when you handle them. They are quite um, fragile when you're pulling them apart with your fingers. You don't want to tear off all the foliage from the stem. And all I'm doing right now really is just playing around with and moving around all these different foliage elements until they're arranged in a way that it feels good and it feels very natural on the base. Now remember again that the look that we're going for is a desert feel with a little bit of foliage. So we don't want too much going on, otherwise it's going to start looking like a garden um, or something a little more lively to it. So now that we're happy with this, we're just going to go piece by piece. Pull it off with a tweezer, apply a dab of super glue, and then attach our tuft. And that looks pretty good. I'm very happy with that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to let this base dry. So we've used quite a bit of super glue on there, and we're going to do one more pass of weathering powder to sort of tie everything together, knock back some of the strength of this green, and just give the entire thing a very dusty, windblown feel to it. We want to make sure that the super glue has been given sufficient time to dry, so that when we go to apply our weathering powder pass, it doesn't then gunk up and create a paste. We also want to make sure that when we're brushing across with our weathering powders, our brush doesn't pull apart or tear off any of the foliage. So we'll set this aside to dry probably for about a half hour, and then we'll come back and do our final pass of weathering powders. And now that the super glue on our base is dried, we're going to do a final pass of weathering powders. And for this, we're just going to be using our dark yellow ochre and our burnt umber again in a 50-50 mix. And we're just going to do a pass over the tufts and all the foliage, taking care not to break these weeds off. And you can see how this pass just sort of dulls down and ties sort of all the colors on the base together. It makes it a little grittier, and it definitely feels a lot more like a desert as opposed to a garden. So I already have a bit of this 50-50 mix from my first pass. And once we're happy with this, we're just going to spritz on a liberal amount of our mineral spirits, and this will help set the weathering powders onto the base and make it much more durable for gameplay. Now keep in mind that the mineral spirits, as it dries and evaporates, will knock back the strength of some of this weathering powder. And so when you apply it, you can be a little more liberal with the application. And then once the mineral spirits dries, you may find that depending on the look you want, you'll have to go back and do another application of the powder and then the mineral spirits to help it set. With the weathering powder set and the mineral spirits fully evaporated, you see I've glued the model onto the base. And to finish it, all we're going to do is we're going to take some black and we're just going to paint the trim to neaten it all up.